I'm sure there are several people in this audience who maybe went through school as a kid and just had an affinity for the creative arts. And you feel a little bit more about a play or a movie you see in music, etc. So I always knew I wanted to be an artist of some kind. Did a lot of creative stuff growing up. I was terrible at math, so I couldn't do anything with that. I eventually went to the School of the Art Institute, which led to an opportunity to work at Playboy magazine as a member of the graphic design team, but for no pay. And I thought they were just being nice, and they said, you should be illustrating for us. Your stuff is really good. And they sent me home, and a couple weeks later, they sent me my first assignment for Playboy, and I was still at the School of the Art Institute. So I started doing a lot of illustration in the city of Chicago. And the reason I bring that up is the art director of Playboy said, Jack, I know you're looking for full-time work. There's a pinball company in the northwest side of Chicago. This is how old I am, by the way. There's a pinball game on the northwest side of Chicago getting into this new thing called video games. He said, if I was young again, that's what I'd get into. It's gonna be big. And so that's how I had my first interview with Williams Electronics, with Ken Fedesna, the guy with the gray hair you saw on screen, and they were doing a game called Joust at the time, and so my career began there. I don't know how much you want me to leap from.
No, that's a perfect transition. It's a great segue. So one of the things I do want to bring up, because I've always been trying to figure out the timeline of things. So it turns out that, well before I ever, worked at Midway and got to meet Jack and such, I had seen his artwork and had seen him on TV or something before without even knowing it. And so I'm bringing up like works such as this, which is a very iconic piece of digital art. So some of you who are probably older, like myself, remember the early days of the Amiga and when the Macs first started doing graphics and things like that. It was like really incredible times. So this image has recently come up in the last few years and such. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Because I feel like it's such a piece of digital art history.
Well, I know John can share stories like this too. When you're in the crunch of something and you're like, well, I have to do that illustration, I got to do that. And this was a sort of a table of contents illustration for a computer that I was the art director for called the Amiga. And the reason I became the art director of the Amiga was guys at Williams Valley Midway. It was just Williams Electronics at that time, but went out to California and they said, hey Jack, we're starting a company in this place called Silicon Valley. Again, I'm an old guy. So it's like Silicon Valley was in its infancy too. And I did this table of contents illustration for the Amiga as we were working on it. And then just last year, somebody contacted me on the internet who I didn't know at all, and he said, you might want to check out this page on YouTube. Somebody's doing a thing on a piece of your artwork called 4-Byte Burger. And this guy in England did this remarkable piece where he, it was like an archaeological dig. He said, this is my favorite work of digital art, and I'm gonna tell you why. And he tried to recreate it, and he did a great job, but in the course of it, it was a beautiful piece. The thing that amazed me about him and the piece and the internet is that I think 100%, I didn't see a single negative comment, and it was one comment after another about how well this guy created this piece, how passionate he was about it and everything. So it's just funny how something from decades ago can appear like that on the internet. I'm sure you have lots of incidents like that, John.
Yeah. I mean, art that I created decades and decades ago still is resurfacing, I guess. Yeah.
Which one was that?
Well, no, I just mean, so like comic book illustrations I did, people are finding them and scanning them and that kind of stuff, and things that I haven't myself seen in decades I'm seeing again.
Yeah, did any of you remember the real Ghostbusters cartoon back in the day? So John was the artist for the comic book, and was that like a local publisher?
Yeah, there was a publisher called Now Comics, and they were located in downtown Chicago, and Yeah, my first job, my first professional, well, I had done a couple of smaller gigs, but my first steady job was illustrating that comic book. And that was what I did before Jack and the guys brought me on at Midway. But that was a great experience. I think I used that job to kind of pay my way through school, through college.
What school did you go to?
So I went to, well, I went to the Art Institute as well, but they had a thing called the Early College Program back then. And so I got some college credits while I was in high school. And then I ended up, I had a counselor at the Art Institute who thought that I should be an animator. Actually, his idea was for me to go out to CalArt to become a Disney animator back then. And I couldn't afford it. So I ended up going, my next thing was commercial art. So he thought, well, you should be a commercial artist, didn't really see me as a fine artist. So suggested that I go to the American Academy of Art, also in downtown Chicago. So I ended up going there, and had always intended to save my money and go to CalArts eventually. Even when I was at Midway, I was thinking, this is temporary, I'm gonna do this for a little bit, save my pennies and go to CalArts, but video games kind of took off for me. So.
Yeah, it's funny, American Academy, a lot of the artists around the time you started there came from American Academy, right?
Yeah, that's true. So Jack hired a fellow by the name of John Vogel, who was also at the American Academy of Art. John was like a year ahead of me. So John graduated first and started the job at Midway. And then at some point they were looking for new artists. And I don't know what conversations you had with John at the time, but John called me up, and I had experience with digital art. So I had done a lot of digital art on my VIC-20. I had done digital art on the Amiga in high school, and on my Apple IIc. And so I had a portfolio that was kind of a mix of traditional illustration and some digital art. That's what I brought in to show Jack. And so based on that portfolio, Jack had hired me.
Yeah, and speaking of like the Amiga, this was in a clip that was from the film, obviously, but I do remember this video and it convinced me to buy an Amiga. I was just about to go into college. I had no idea what I wanted to study. It was either going to be, it was going to be animation or video or something like that. But I remember seeing this video about the Amiga, thinking like how easy it is to do cool digital art and videos and things like that, and it just blew my mind. And I didn't, obviously at the time I didn't know who Jack. Obviously I knew who Debbie Harry and Andy Warhol were, but little did I know that however many years later, 5 years later, when I graduated from college, that it would end up, meeting Jack later on. It just blew my mind on that.
Actually, it's a similar anecdote. So when I was in high school, I took a TV production class, and they had gotten a new computer sent in. I went to Chicago Public School, and it was in a box. It was the Amiga. And so they had, my instructor, one of my professors had called me down and said, hey, we got this new computer, can you open the box? So I unboxed it and turned it on and stuff, and was just blown away, at the quality of the artwork. And I didn't know it was Jack's artwork. I, discovered that later, years and years later when I was hired. Jack, talked to me about the work that he had done in the Amiga, and that was incredible. That was such a the idea that I would experience that artwork as a teenager and then be hired by the fellow who produced that artwork was an incredible coincidence. So.
One thing you'll learn is that I don't know how many of you all here are students and such, but when you go into certain industries, you find out industries are really small, but in the video game industry, it's really small. So you get to know one person and you find out that you actually ran into them or saw their artwork, a long time before that. Even before I went to college or anything like that, I was like total arcade rat in the 80s and such, and so I was, much like many people who were teenagers, they were, being away into video games. But, and I had to bring this one image up because I remember seeing this game called Star Rider that I felt like, I'm gonna play this, that I thought was just amazing. I don't know how many people have seen this game, but when I found out that Jack worked on this game, and I found out later on that it was a very expensive game that was, that was really rough on Williams. But at the time, it blew my mind because around then, like the first Tron movie had come out, and so for me, it's all about computer graphics and such. But it's, I just wanted to bring this up because this is something I wanted to talk about in the film. It just can't fit in there. Can you tell us a little bit about it because it felt so innovative at the time?
Well, yeah, it really was. It was a laser disc platform games, so you get to decision points, and that's how Dragon's Lair was the most popular and most successful. I believe the spirit who is present with us tonight, but was responsible for this, and you have to believe this name when I tell you. He was a game designer at Midway, Williams at the time, named Python Angelo. And when I started there, a couple people said, well, of course, we have Python Angelo working with us. And I'm like, am I supposed to know who this is? And I was always curious. I go, wait a minute, when he gets his paycheck, what does it say? Does it say Python Angelo? And his real name was Vladimir, but he went by Python. And he was a brilliant, and some might say crazy, artist, game designer from Romania who had these fantastic stories. And Python had the concept for Star Rider and of multiple worlds, and we had the game all rendered at a formal rendering studio in Indiana at the time. Yeah, it was a very expensive game. I did foreground images, but it just goes to show you how much even Williams Electronics, we were always pushing, always trying to do new things, do things differently.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Back in, I guess, was this the mid '80s at this point with that?
Yes.
Yeah, so there were a lot of these Laserdisc games. People have seen like Dragon's Lair, those types of games. There's fully animated videos and such. And so just seeing this Laserdisc with this digital motorcycle overlay on it was just kind of amazing to see. But yeah, but to Jack's point, that the team at Williams seemed like they were always looking for the next new thing, the next big leap in technology.
Yeah, and I kind of want to touch on what John said about his work and everything, and when he was starting out. So as I sort of evolved into the role of art director at Williams Valley Midway, and besides trying to develop games myself, contribute to games myself, I was always looking for new talent for the team, and I would interview a lot of people during the year. And you would get people coming in, young students and everything, with their version of Batman or Spider-Man and everything, and it'd be okay, and I'd have to kind of assess where they might fit in with this group. And you can see how it became a pretty tight group, and you'd have to find people like puzzle pieces almost. And when John came in, his work was like none other, and there was so much original work in there, and the skill and ability in his artwork was evident right from the start, and the focus and passion was evident as well, and it was just immediate. Like, we gotta hire this guy. We gotta hire this guy. I felt bad because the budgets they gave me were ridiculous. I know some comments you made about that, and it's true, but I'm so grateful that we brought John on, which then led to Sal DeVita, Carlos Pacina, Marty Martinez, so many other people that you influenced and helped me see and bring in. So yeah, I'm ready to push back and let John, because I'm fascinated.
So what was it like when to enter Midway? I mean, you were like, what was it in your bingo card that ended up working in video games? Obviously, you wanted to be in animation.
Yeah, well, so I loved video games and was an arcade junkie growing up, but I didn't think it was accessible. In fact, I wasn't even aware that video games were developed in Chicago. I was aware that there was a pinball manufacturing facility on the north side. I had an uncle who actually worked in the factory when I was younger, so I was aware of that, but I didn't know that video games were being developed. So when John Vogel called and said, "Hey, here's what I'm doing right now," and they're looking for someone new, and I came in and was interviewed by Jack and the guys. And learned who they were. I learned that Jack did Sinistar, and I was a big Sinistar player growing up, and I was just shocked that, wait, they made that here? I was in disbelief. So I was happy to take the job. I still thought that I wanted to do. I had other aspirations. I wanted to be a famous comic book artist. I wanted to go and do animation. I was young and thought I could do everything. To be able to create video games was something that I had not anticipated, and so it was a super pleasant surprise to come in and get interviewed. And when I got the job, I enjoyed every moment of work. In fact, I wouldn't share this with folks at Midway, but I remember thinking at the time, these suckers are paying me to do this stuff. It's crazy, and I was like making $19,000 a year, or whatever it was. But I was just happy to do the work and happy to be around other creative people, and I would have done it for free. I mean, that's how much I enjoyed the work. So, but it was like I said, it was a pleasant surprise, and I enjoyed every moment of it.
And the one thing I want to make sure just to backtrack a little bit is beyond comic books, though, John also has a background in graffiti and street art. Tell us a little bit about your career in street art.
So I grew up on the near west side of Chicago, and in the inner city, rough neighborhood, and I was always looking. I mean, like Jack expressed it, even as a young kid, I just loved art. I loved telling stories. I just loved to show people things that made them feel something. And so, growing up in that environment, the one thing I would do is I was a bit of an introvert, but I'd love to sit at home and draw. And I think that I had friends who were getting into graffiti art, at the time. This is the early '80s, I learned that I can create a piece of artwork on a little corner of a building, and people would see it, and I would gain some degree of notoriety from that piece. But people enjoyed looking at the art, and I liked expressing myself, and it was the one thing at the time growing up in that neighborhood. There were gangs everywhere, and graffiti art was sort of like a pass. It was like this the one thing that you could do as a young man growing up in that environment in Chicago that gave you a pass. Even the gangbangers knew what you did and how you expressed yourself. They kind of left you alone. They admired your work and they left you alone. And so it kind of was, served two purposes. One was it allowed me to express myself artistically. I know that graffiti art is what it is. But the other thing was, I think a lot of it was about survival in that environment. It's difficult to think about. I mean, actually, Chicago's maybe even rougher now in some areas, but that's kind of what that was about. But I made a lot of friends there. The work ethic, I think of graffiti artists as being vandals, which sometimes they are, I guess. But the good thing about it was that I got to meet a lot of other artists, and the work ethic was incredible, and that's something that I carried with me into my professional career. Yeah,
that's for sure.
We obviously we just saw the film and just all that incredible work that Midway's done. For either of you, what is the one or two defining things about Midway that really made it different from other companies making games of that era? And when I say Midway, it's Williams Valley and Midway altogether.
So Midway was the only company that I had worked for making games. At the time, it was all I knew. But I did feel a bit, I wouldn't call it a chip, on my shoulder. But what I would say is I did feel like there was a grittiness about working at Midway, and there was a grit involved with the people who work there. I guess it may have been, sort of a Midwest work ethic. Everybody worked really hard. And as goofy as we were at the time, we took the work that we did very seriously. Again, I think that's what I remember about it most was just the work ethic and how much everyone cared about the work that they were doing.
Yeah, and I think, definitely, I guess Midway would have that same story, but you don't get a sense of it in the documentary, because the documentary, of course, focuses on the arcade video game development. But we also shared the building and the facilities with pinball design and pinball designers. And several of these people are still in the industry and still making pinball games. And I think a lot of that goes with what John said. The work ethic was amazing. And some of the people are just always regarded. Steve Ritchie, Dennis Nordman, Pat Lawler, are regarded as some of the greatest pinball designers ever. And for the most part, they're still making games. It wasn't uncommon for us to leave the building at 2 or 3 in the morning if you needed to or wanted to work that schedule. And I don't know too many companies that promote that. It's not feasible, but that's what we did.
You know, one of the things is that, like, was it, you know, working those crazy hours and just, you know, and just the work ethic? So was it something that was from, you know, the top down, or was it just something that was just self-managed? That, you know, just, you know, we're all just kind of just decided to do that.
I think it was a bit self-managed because it really was a creative-driven department. We also did have a dedicated sound and music department, so you're dealing with really good musicians and composers. And from that end, creativity doesn't always, you know, show up at 1:30 p.m. after lunch and then you leave for home at 5:30. You might hit like, oh geez, what we should be doing is this, and you get going on it, and then before you know it, it's 2:30 in the morning. We couldn't do that it wasn't, you know, sustainable every day, but it was very common.
Yeah, I had, I was just thinking back, I had mentioned I illustrated comic books while I was in school, and what I remember about that period of time was I would go to school in the daytime, and then I would come home and I'd illustrate the comic book in the evening, and sometimes I would stay up all night. I remember watching the sun would come up, and then I would take a shower, go hop on the train, and go to school, you know, the next day. So I was kind of used to working in that fashion, but I remember going to Midway, and the people were, I mean, you know, that was already there before I got there. So whether it was Jack or Eugene or the other folks who were working in the department at the time, you could see that they cared about what they were doing and would put in these, you know, these hours to get the work done. And so I just absorbed, I think, that behavior from the people around me, and it was infectious in a way. How sustainable it, you know, that is once you know, you grow up, you get married, you know, you have kids, and that kind of thing. But when you're, you know, when you're of a certain age and you've got that kind of passion, like I said, I would have done it for free. I just enjoyed the, you know, the work itself.
I think is one of the more unique things is that because our studio was, you know, part of the factory, that we actually saw the entire, like, I want to say food chain of how a game is made. And so we're always aware, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, but we're always aware that if a game was late or didn't ship, then people in the factory would be out of work. So it was always in our faces that, you know, that if something didn't work out, that it's not just our job that was on the line, there were like many others, and you know, you don't see that as much nowadays, because if you're doing, let's say, a home game, mobile game, it just goes off into the cloud somewhere, and you don't know what is affecting. But yeah, just that grit of having a factory right there was always in our face.
Yeah, that's true. So thinking back, you know, Neil said it, you know, in the video. The idea that, you know, this is, so coin-op is it's like a machine of production. It's like, you know, there's a factory assembling the machines that are being, you know, shipped out and put into the arcades, and a little bit different from software today. I do remember being conscious of that fact that, you know, when you were working on a game and there was a date that the game had to be done by, if you missed that date, the unfortunate circumstance would be they would shut the line down, people might get laid off. There was a lot, you know, put on our shoulders today. It wasn't just about the game itself, you know, like Josh said, a lot of it was also about keeping people on the factory lines employed.
And there was a little bit of that rush of, you might have had an animation sequence that you were developing, and then, well, gee, if I get this into Ed's hand in time, I can't go home. I got to see it.
Oh,
I have
that's
to
right,
see it in the game.
Yeah.
And it just became addictive, you know, that way too.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about just technology back in the day. I think it's one thing that I always like to kind of remind people that, especially you know, those who are doing software development, especially game development now. I don't want to sound like a cranky old man, but like, you guys have it so much easier nowadays and such. You know, but we have such incredible tools. But and you know, if you look at some of the games of that period, how great they looked was because everything was custom made, you know, by the programmers. There was no Photoshop. Like it'd be equivalent of telling somebody, hey, go draw something, and then they would have to first make Photoshop first before they could draw it. And so we can talk a little bit about just, you know, the innovations in regards to the art tools that we had that allowed us to make such incredible looking games.
Sure. Well, at the very start for me at Williams, when Joust was still underway, we would be working literally on an arcade game. The artist would have an arcade game, and you'd have a joystick and buttons, and this button was draw, and this button, and you'd bang the joystick, and then you'd select your color and select, and then bang the joystick, and work on a grid for each frame of animation. One of the greatest programmers I worked with at this time, and I feel like not enough of this is celebrated. We had several really great female programmers early in the day. Christina D'Onofrio was the initial programmer after Joust, who I had to learn hexadecimal through. And again, I was not a math guy, and I'm like, hexa what? And that's how in Photoshop, where everything is a funny, colors are funny numbers and everything now. But Christina went on to do security stuff for the government. I mean, she's high up there, and was just a sensational programmer and a really great person to work with. So the tools were really crude in that sense. And then when I went out to work on the Amiga, came back, and Eugene Jarvis came back from school at the same time from California. We were working on new hardware, and basically our processor through Mark Lafredo could do simultaneous processing. So it could grab an image, one of the characters, and then it could be and you could display that on the system, and it could be displaying the next image at the same time and ready to be displayed in the game. So that's why everything could be so fast. That's why NARC, we called it a bus. So images were on the bus, and Mark Lafredo was responsible for that. So like you said, everything was, for the most part, homegrown. We used Texas Instrument processors at the time, but that, and then software, Warren Davis did the WTARG system, which helped take these green screened or gray screened, and we did gray screen for, and you probably saw that on the video. It's like, well, why are they shooting against gray with Mortal Kombat? Because it was easier to clean the background from the edge of the character. John can probably talk about that.
Well, when we were shooting on analog cameras, which is when I started, I think that we were, digital wasn't really even there yet. So we would shoot on analog cameras, and we would digitize from the videotape, at the time. And but the gray screen, behind the characters to reduce the bleed, the color bleed on the characters, that was already, I think, established by you guys. You had maybe done that on NARC. Yeah. But a lot of that stuff was already underway. Like I inherited a lot of the work that Jack and the other guys had already done prior to me joining Midway. So a lot of the tools and techniques were already, I think, kind of in place. And then as the years went on, everything just kind of got fine-tuned. I think Warren left for a bit, and then he came back, and then tuned up sort of the software that we were working with. And then we continued to advance in terms of the digital technology, like digital cameras, I think, kind of had come out at the time. Jack was actually the one who was kind of there pushing I remember when we went to green screen, or blue screen, it was blue screen. Jack, you were the one, I think, who kind of was setting all that up. And but the technology changed so quickly, and just improved so rapidly. You can even see from Mortal Kombat 1 to 2 to 3, the graphical improvements that were kind of getting made. I was just, an inheritor of, the work that Warren was doing.
I think one of the things that to look at, and after this, if you go to the exhibit and look at some of the games, one of the things to keep in mind is, it's easy for us to say, hey, characters got digitized, got put in the computer, and things like that. Nowadays, it's very easy to do. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is when you look at these games, especially Mortal Kombat 2, when you see the color fidelity, it's because the artist actually touched every single frame of animation. So it wasn't just, hey, digitize the video and pop it in the game, which a lot of companies back in the day were doing. They were kind of jumping on that trend. They didn't touch up every single image. And I might be taking a leap in logic here, but I think to give you credit, is that coming from your comic book background and your animation background, like you knew which frames were needed and then made sure that those frames looked as good as possible. And I think that's why they hold up so well. It's just that hand touching.
Yeah, well, after a while working with on Mortal Kombat, working with the actors, but then frame selection became an art form, knowing which frames to select.
Poses, they make sure that the right pose.
Exactly right, yeah, knowing when to hold a pose and stuff. That's something I think that we refined over the course of those 3 digitized versions of MK. And the work that Warren did on the tools that we used allowed us to kind of shuttle through the frames and pick things. And I remember for me the one thing with Mortal Kombat and the lighting of the characters was I preferred, I wanted to dramatically light them, and I was okay with not having a clean capture if it meant that the characters were dramatically lit. And in the first game, because of the constrained schedule that we're working on, I remember we just kind of gave in to the raw qualities of the captured video. We didn't do much touch-up at all. MK2 was a little different, we had a little more time. I think the tools maybe had changed a little bit, and so I was able to kind of get in there and do a little bit more hand manipulation of each individual frame.
So right now, how do you feel about, we've all been in the game industry for a really long time now, and so both of you are still in the industry. This is going to be a very big question, but if you can somehow pinpoint now, what are some of the biggest, differences between game development then compared to now? And you're, because Jack, you're still working in pinball right now.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, I've evolved into pinball in a backdoor way, in kind of a funny way. John, I don't know if John's even aware of this. A company had a concept for a pinball game that would look like a tank. It was already, the cabinet was already designed, so when you fold the back box down, it looks like a tank, and it was called Galactic Tank Force. And the people that brought me in wanted me in for the sole reason of you helped get that Mortal Kombat thing going. Can you do that for us too? So we shot, it was like deja vu all over again. So I was filming live actors, costumes for video. So there's a video display in the back box, and it's very campy. It's supposed to be campy and kind of silly. So that was kind of retro. So pinball design still holds on to its roots. I know John has been working on bigger teams in San Diego. We both worked for Zynga. I worked in the Chicago office, but you can talk about your experience there.
Well, yeah, so I kind of worked in every bit of the game industry. I mean, I worked on coin-op, worked in console, then worked on mobile phone products for a while, back to console now. But certainly the scale of production has changed. When we were at Midway back in the day, the teams were much smaller. They were composed pretty consistently of just engineers and artists and
It was like the first Mortal Kombat was like 5 people.
4. Me, Ed, John, and Dan Ford. 4 of us. Yeah, that's right, 4 of us. Yeah, and I think that was about the standard size of games, just 2, 3, 4 people. But yeah, it's so different now. I mean, teams of hundreds that you kind of have to manage. So the process is a little bit different, and the scale is much different. The scale of economy is much different. The cost to make these things is astronomical nowadays.
Yeah. And I think it's important for Josh to speak to that too. You've had a front row seat for several years developing console games and doing amazing things. How has that been for you?
It's funny. I think working at Midway as as my first job out of college and in video games especially, it was so crazy and hard that everything else felt easier in comparison. So and I enjoyed all of it and such, but it's I've worked on many games with huge teams and everything, and even during the crunch, it just never felt as hard as it was at Midway. So I
think so. The development process has matured. While we're at Midway, and certainly post Midway, the process changed. No longer was it just programmers and artists. It was now you've got designers, game designers, and producers, and there's a litany of production staff required to kind of get a game done today. But it was quite different, back in the day. It was, it's like if you weren't an artist or a programmer, it's like, well, what good are you?
Yeah. We're forced to generalize, to be generalists on so many things. So I think that's why it's just now, everyone has kind of their, lack of a better term, silos to get into, and
Yeah, I agree with
it
that.
does make life, a bit easier. One of the things I do want to make sure we talk about, though, just because you brought up the tank thing, is, how unique it was to make games for arcades back then, because not only were you doing the software, but we had our hands in the hardware and the cabinet design. And that was always a lot of fun. I just remember watching John and Jack designing the cabinet artwork, but even just the controllers, whether you're making a gun game or a fighting game, putting the button layout, making sure it fit great, everything was customized for the game. It was like a real one-to-one relationship between the software and the hardware. And so I thought that was like super unique.
Yeah, I know watching the film, believe me, it's kind of tough to see yourself, 100 feet tall, whatever that is. And I know I come off as sort of the soft guy sometimes. This is one of my later games at Midway called Carnival, and it had a great design team with me, Scott Tukulski and Sam Zaire, and a bunch
Highly underrated game.
But it was a gun game. Again, management said, could you guys do another gun game? But we did a 3D gun game. And this literally was, part of it was my response, because like we said, it became very territorial, and John and Ed had pretty much pissed over anything that had to do with Orient or Kung Fu fighting or Asian stuff. So I'm like, what am I gonna do? So this game takes place in Iowa, and the bad guys are from Luxembourg, and with sort of French-German accents, and so it has sort of a Tim Burton kind of quality to it.
Yeah, Carnival was amazing. I remember watching you guys develop that at the time and just being loving every bit of it. It's like the idea of an evil carnival. It's like, yeah, I'm in.
And it just dawned on me. It was another evolution. It was so innovative because it kind of touched on the technology from Star Rider, where it was a video playing in the background with digital elements on top of it. This was, the background movies were just like such high quality. And
They were pre-rendered 3D.
Yeah. So if you ever get a chance to go to Galloping Ghost or Prince Arcades, they have Carnival there, and it's fantastic. You should really check it out. I do want to open it up to questions. There are microphones on the sides here. If anyone has some questions.